bring the parties together to discuss humanitarian issues, including safe passage for civilians and the movement of humanitarian convoys. Earlier this week, Martin was warmly received in Ankara by the Minister of Foreign Affairs, His Excellency Mevlut Cavusoglu, and presidential spokesperson Ibrahim Kalin. Their discussions focused on Turkish support to the UN's efforts towards progress on pressing humanitarian concerns in Ukraine. We must explore all options to reach more people where needs are the greatest. We remain firmly committed to leaving no stone unturned, to find measures from local pauses to wider ceasefires to save lives. The world expects this of us. The people of Ukraine deserves this. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank Ms. Masuya for her briefing. I now give the floor to Mr. Omar Abdi.
Thank you, Mr. President. Excellencies, I would like first to express our appreciation to Ambassadors De La Fuente and Riviere for convening today's meeting. I would also like to thank the United States for hosting this briefing during your Security Council presidency. It has been just 1 month since UNICEF last briefed this Council on the situation of children in Ukraine. As each day passes, more Ukrainian children are exposed to the horrors of this war. In just this past month, the UN verified that nearly 100 children were killed, and we believe the actual figure is to be considerably higher. More children have been injured and face grave violations of their rights. Millions more have been displaced. The schools continue to be attacked and used for military purposes, and water and sanitation infrastructure impacted. The war in Ukraine, like all wars, is a child protection and child rights crisis. Last month, UNICEF briefed this council following the attack on Kramatorsk train station, an attack on families fleeing the violence, and which interrupted the work of our team on the ground to deliver desperately needed humanitarian assistance. We meet again today after another horrifying attack, this time on a school in Luhansk, yet another stark example of disregard for civilian lives. Today, even more families are mourning the loss of loved ones. It is also a stark reminder that in Ukraine today, education is also under attack. In February, the school year came to a standstill when the war broke out. As of last week, at least 15 of 89 UNICEF-supported schools in eastern Ukraine had been damaged or destroyed since the start of the war. Hundreds of schools across the country are reported to have been hit by heavy artillery, airstrikes, and other explosive weapons in populated areas, whilst other schools are being used as information centers, shelters, supply hubs, or for military purposes, with long-term impact on children's return to education. These attacks must stop. All parts must honor their legal and moral obligation to protect civilians and civilian infrastructure, to respect international humanitarian and human rights law, and to ensure the rights of children are upheld. In 2021, this Council adopted Resolution 2601, which condemns attacks on schools and calls for all necessary safeguards to uphold the right to education. The Safe Schools Declaration outlines what is needed to enhance the protection of education in conflict. What is needed now is the courage, discipline, and political will to translate these words into action. Excellencies, schools are a lifeline for children, especially in conflict. Schools are a safe place with routines provided, protection from harm, and a semblance of normalcy. Schools are also critical conduits for information about the risk of deadly explosive ordnance, and they are a connector to essential health and psychosocial services. The education workforce in Ukraine, teachers, principals, social workers, psychologists, and other professionals are equally impacted by this conflict. Supporting them so they can stay and deliver is more important than ever. We must also ensure creative, multifaceted, and flexible solutions that combine low and high-tech methods to reach all children and minimize disruptions to their learning. In mid-March, over 15,000 schools resumed education in Ukraine, mostly through remote learning or in-person hybrid options. The Ministry of Education and Science, supported by UNICEF and other partners, is doing everything possible to reach Ukrainian children, including supporting online education from kindergarten through grade 11. We are also supporting an ongoing digital campaign on explosive ordnance risk education while providing education-related supplies. However, remote learning can only be a temporary solution. Lessons from the pandemic, that's COVID-19 pandemic, show the importance of children learning in a school setting with their peers and teachers. In the broader region, thanks to the European Union's Temporary Protection Directive, governments and municipalities in neighboring countries are enrolling children in national school systems and alternative education pathways. This is helping ensure the continuity of children's learning and supporting their completion of the school year. It is estimated that 3.7 million children in Ukraine and abroad are using online and distance learning options. But enormous obstacles remain, including capacity and resource constraints, language barriers, and unpredictable movements of children and their families. We must make every effort to reach those most at risk of being left behind. For the youngest learners, access to education can be especially challenging. Less than 5% of the refugee preschool-age children are estimated to be enrolled in public kindergarten. Children with disabilities need access to inclusive services and assistive technology, as well as targeted programs to cover their specific needs, including rehabilitation. In the last month, we have seen small moments of relief as children and other civilians evacuated from Mariupol and other frontline locations reach relative safety. Humanitarians have reached millions of people in need across the country with health, education, water and essential supplies, as well as information, counseling, and psychosocial support. Yet, we know that the situation for children and their families in conflict-affected areas without access to humanitarian assistance continues to be grim. Children and parents tell us of their living hell, where they were forced to go hungry, drink from muddy puddles, and shelter from constant shelling and bombardments, dodging bombs, bullets, and landmines as they fled. The war in Ukraine has also had a devastating impact on the most vulnerable children globally, as food and fuel prices spike to all-time high. Children already affected by conflict and climate crisis across the world, from Afghanistan to Yemen and the Horn of Africa, are now paying a deadly price for another war far from their doorsteps. The repercussions of the war in Ukraine will continue to ripple across the globe. Excellencies, Ukrainian children have been uprooted from their homes, separated from caregivers, and directly exposed to war. Their schools have been destroyed, and the critical infrastructure essential to their survival and well-being, including hospitals and water and sanitation systems, are being devastated by the fighting. Ukrainian children tell us that they want to reunite with their families, to return to their communities, to go to school and play in their neighborhoods. Children are resilient, but they shouldn't have to be. They have already paid an unconscionably high price in this war. We must do everything possible to help ensure it doesn't also cost them their futures. Once again, as humanitarians, we will do everything we can to continue meeting the needs of children affected by this war, to provide safety, stability, and protection. But this will never be enough. Ultimately, children need an end to this war. Their futures hang in the balance. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank Mr. Abdi for his briefing. I would like to draw the attention of speakers to paragraph 22 of Note 507, which encourages all participants in council meetings to deliver their statements in 5 minutes or less, in line with the Security Council's commitment to making more effective use of open meetings. And I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of Mexico.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente. Agradezco las presentaciones de la señora Joyce Suya, así como del señor Abdi. Sus exposiciones confirman nuestra preocupación sobre el terrible impacto en las vidas de niñas y niños que tiene el conflicto en Ucrania y razón por la que mi país y Francia solicitamos esta sesión. En tanto no se logre un cese a las hostilidades, las prioridades de la comunidad internacional deben ser la asistencia humanitaria, la protección de la población civil, en particular grupos en mayor situación de vulnerabilidad, como niños y niñas, y evitar más daños a la infraestructura elemental para su supervivencia. Ataques como el ocurrido contra una escuela en la región de Lugansk son absolutamente inaceptables y condenables. Atacar escuelas es una clara violación al derecho internacional humanitario que no debemos pasar por alto. En este sentido, estamos atentos a la labor del fiscal de la Corte Penal Internacional. Lamentamos que este incidente de Lugansk no sea un caso aislado. En todo momento debe evitarse el uso de armas explosivas cerca de escuelas e instituciones de enseñanza superior y sus vías de acceso. Asimismo, las Fuerzas Armadas deben estar adecuadamente capacitadas para evitar afectar a la población civil. Señor presidente, el impacto de la guerra en la niñez es simplemente devastador. Como ha indicado UNICEF, 2/3 partes de los niños y niñas ucranianos se han visto desplazados por el conflicto, teniendo que abandonar, en la mayoría de los casos, el único hogar que conocían. Este conflicto afecta además la salud mental y el bienestar psicosocial de toda una generación, los desplazados y los que se quedaron. El trauma que genera esta guerra no discrimina y los constantes bombardeos y el asedio psicológico de alertas por ataques inminentes tendrán repercusiones de largo plazo y muy profundas. Reconocemos los esfuerzos de UNICEF y de otras instituciones para atender esta crisis de salud mental y consideramos necesario que se delineen estrategias integrales para atender este flagelo. Por otra parte, nos preocupa el incremento de los reportes de casos de violencia sexual contra niñas y niños para quienes los servicios de apoyo son sumamente limitados. La afectación a las instalaciones de salud se traduce también en el deterioro a los servicios de salud sexual y reproductiva y de los cuidados para recién nacidos. La ola masiva de desplazamientos ha convertido a los niños y niñas y a los adolescentes en un objetivo para las redes de trata de personas y son especialmente vulnerables los menores no acompañados o aquellos separados. Llamamos a los países receptores e instituciones como la ONU e Interpol a que enfrenten estas nuevas circunstancias y a registrar e identificar a menores refugiados. Finalmente, no podemos dejar de referirnos a la situación de las niñas y niños con discapacidad, cuya vulnerabilidad es aún más aguda. Por otra parte, México subraya la importancia de que cualquier niño procedente de Ucrania o de cualquier otro país se le brinde el mismo trato. No puede haber un sistema con dos niveles de estándar en el trato a refugiados. Señor presidente, para terminar, cualquier guerra es una guerra contra la niñez y esta no es excepción. Por ello, solicitamos al secretario general y a la representante especial sobre niñez en conflicto armado a que en el próximo informe sobre el tema se incluya a Ucrania con miras a que se establezca un mecanismo de monitoreo y reporte, se enlisten a las partes responsables de violaciones graves en contra de la niñez y se atienda a la situación en el grupo de trabajo sobre niñez en conflicto armado. Muchas gracias, señor presidente.
I thank the representative of Mexico for her statement. I now give the floor to the representative of France.
Monsieur le Président, Je remercie Madame Souya et Monsieur Abdi pour leurs interventions. L'agression russe se poursuit inexorablement. L'armée russe continue de tuer des civils, y compris des enfants, et à détruire des infrastructures civiles. Nous savons tous que le nombre de victimes civiles est largement supérieur aux chiffres actuellement communiqués. La chef de la mission de surveillance des droits de l'homme en Ukraine a évoqué des milliers de morts supplémentaires, y compris à Mariupol, ce trou noir auquel il est si difficile d'accéder. Le coût de la guerre pour l'enfance est terrible. 2/3 des enfants ukrainiens ont été déplacés et la majorité déscolarisés. La France condamne toutes les attaques contre des écoles, notamment celle de Bilohorivka. Plus de 200 infrastructures médicales ont par ailleurs été attaquées ou détruites, selon l'OMS. Les attaques contre les écoles et les hôpitaux, ainsi que les meurtres et les mutilations d'enfants, font partie des graves violations du droit international humanitaire et des droits des enfants en temps de guerre. La France appelle le secrétaire général à faire usage de tous les mécanismes établis par le Conseil de sécurité pour vérifier les faits et établir les responsabilités. Parmi ceux-ci figure en particulier le rapport annuel du secrétaire général et sa liste d'infamies. Ceux qui tuent les enfants et attaquent les écoles ont toute leur place sur cette liste. Ces crimes ne resteront pas impunis. La France continuera de soutenir les enquêtes pour lutter contre l'impunité en apportant son plein soutien à la justice ukrainienne et aux juridictions internationales, y compris la Cour pénale internationale. Monsieur le Président, il y a urgence à agir. Nous appelons la Russie à respecter l'ordonnance rendue par la Cour internationale de justice et à mettre un terme à cette guerre injustifiable et dévastatrice et à retirer ses troupes du territoire ukrainien. La protection des civils et des infrastructures civiles est une priorité. C'est pourquoi nous réitérons notre appel à une cessation immédiate des hostilités. Le respect du droit international humanitaire et des droits de l'homme n'est pas négociable. L'accès doit être garanti. La France appelle les parties à coopérer avec le Haut Commissariat aux droits de l'homme et la commission d'enquête du Conseil des droits de l'homme. La France salue les efforts du secrétaire général, des agences des Nations Unies et du CICR qui ont permis d'évacuer plusieurs centaines de civils de Mariupol. Il est indispensable que les évacuations de civils et des civils et de tous les blessés se poursuivent en laissant le choix aux évacués de leur destination. Nous saluons le travail de l'UNICEF et de l'UNESCO pour permettre aux enfants déplacés d'avoir un accès à l'éducation, y compris à distance. Monsieur le Président, le monde entier est affecté par cette guerre qui accroît chaque jour la menace d'une crise alimentaire majeure. Nous appelons de nouveau la Russie à lever le blocus des ports ukrainiens en mer Noire afin de permettre l'exportation des denrées alimentaires. La France continuera à intensifier ses efforts pour contrer les répercussions négatives de cette guerre sur les pays les plus vulnérables, en particulier dans le cadre de l'initiative FORM. La France et ses partenaires resteront pleinement mobilisés en soutien à l'Ukraine et au peuple ukrainien. Elle continuera également à prendre toute sa part avec une aide qui s'élève à hauteur de 2 milliards de dollars, comme annoncé par le président de la République Emmanuel Macron à l'occasion de la conférence de Varsovie le 5 mai dernier. Alors que nous venons juste de commémorer la fin de la Seconde Guerre mondiale, nous sommes déterminés à continuer de nous mobiliser pour la liberté et la paix en Ukraine sur l'ensemble du continent européen. Je vous remercie.
I thank the representative of France for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Albania.
Thank you, Mr. President, and let me thank Ms. Msuya and Mr. Abdi for the update information. Colleagues, we meet again on Ukraine The war is going on with its destructive path. The overall situation is dire and worsening. People continue to suffer. Lives of countless civilians, particularly women and children, are devastated because of this war of aggression that continues unabated. If one would try to summarize the news that we get every day from Ukraine, including what we heard from the briefers today, it would be continued shelling with mounting civilian victims, targeted cities with large-scale destruction of civilian infrastructure, persistent attacks of hospitals, healthcare facilities, and schools, horrible crimes including extrajudicial killings, torture, rape, and mass graves, countless shocking personal stories of lives uprooted, ripped apart, which will never be the same again. We also hear about the continued Ukrainian resistance against a continued war they did not want, that they did not choose. As the war goes on and intensifies, so does the magnitude of human suffering. Over 7,000 civilian casualties, 14 million people forced to leave their homes in only 3 months. 2 months ago, the UN projected some 4 million people would be displaced by the war. In less than 10 weeks, that number is now 5.8 million. And the new projection is double, 8.3 million. This requires more financial support for refugees and host countries to face challenges with access to food, housing, transportation, and services. Massive destruction of civilian infrastructure has made life unbearable or completely disrupted for millions of people because systematic destruction of health facilities, transport, supplies, and warehouses only affects severely basic services. Mr. President, in this background, we are particularly concerned by reports of unlawful attacks on schools which deprives access of civilians to education. It is unbearable to see a school that used to be a school and now it's a pack of rubble. Schools, just like hospitals, should be safe places, immune to harm, free from attacks. In Ukraine today, they aren't. An average of 22 schools a day have regularly been under attack in Ukraine since the start of the war, disrupting the education of those 5.5 million children that are still in the country. Their school year has ended on the 24th of February. At least 1 in 6 UNICEF-supported schools in eastern Ukraine have been damaged or destroyed since the start of the war. Only a few days ago, more than 60 people were feared dead after a Russian bomb flattened a school being used as a shelter in the village of Bilohorivka and at Luhansk region. There is no justification for such recklessness. Against this desolate picture, we are pleased to highlight that on a positive note, UNESCO Global Education Coalition, composed of some 200 members from private sector, civil society, academia, and the UN family, is working to ensure the right to education and to continue the continuation of learning in Ukraine. Digital devices will be provided to Ukrainian teachers, reaching out to hundreds of thousands of learners to ensure continuity of online learning. Also, a higher education e-assessment platform will allow some 200,000 students to pass their examinations. Dear colleagues, as the military aggression escalates, civilian casualties rise and war crimes and crimes against humanity mount. Reports and preliminary facts gathered on the ground raise serious concerns about grave breaches of international humanitarian law in Ukraine. A report recently published pursuant to the OSCE Moscow mechanism analyzes a shocking range of apparent war crimes from rape to torture to deportation and the use of human shields. It marks an important step in a long road to a full understanding of the illegal and criminal acts committed and suffered in the ongoing aggression. It concludes that, among other, 2 most blatant attacks mentioned several times during our discussions here, the bombing of the Mariupol Maternity House and Children's Hospital and the bombing of Mariupol Drama Theater, where several hundred civilians were killed, constitute most likely an egregious violation of international humanitarian law, and those who ordered or executed it committed a crime. Mr. President, everything should be done to secure the rights of children. And in this respect, we call on the SG and the SRSG on children in armed conflicts to add Ukraine as a situation of concern in the SG upcoming 2022 annual report on children in armed conflicts in light of great violations committed against children in eastern Ukraine between 2014 and 2021, as well as evidence of an alarming increase in grave violations across the country amid the rapid and ongoing escalation of hostilities since late February. Thorough investigation must be carried out and accountability must and will be ensured. Dear colleagues, the seismic effects of Russia's war in Ukraine are felt everywhere. The stores in places far from Russia and Ukraine are running out of cooking oil. Farmers are scrambling to buy fertilizers and governments are struggling to respond to public disquiet due to the sharp rise of prices. Disruptions to the flow of these essential goods are compounding other supply chains, causing shortages and pushing millions of people into hunger. There must be no mistake for who is responsible. Ceasefire arrangements for the evacuation of 600 civilians from the steel plant in Mariupol show that it is possible to find solutions. It is possible to silence the guns in the name of life when there is a will. This should be extended to the soldiers wounded that are still there. We support efforts by USG Griffiths and praise the UN actors on the ground for their contribution and encourage them to continue their efforts. Colleagues, let me end with this. This senseless war must come to an end. The sooner it happens, the better for Ukraine and their people to start healing their profound wounds. The better for Russia and the Russians to get out of a self-victimization attitude. The better for everyone, everywhere. And I thank you.
I thank the representative of Albania for his statement. There's been a small change to our list of speakers, so I give the floor to the representative of Ghana.
I thank you, Mr. President, and the delegations of Mexico and France for convening this meeting. I would like to join previous speakers in thanking Ms. Joyce Misuya and Mr. Omar Abdi for their briefings. Mr. President, after several months of violent conflict in Ukraine and its resultant humanitarian crisis, Ghana is deeply concerned about the lack of satisfactory progress in finding a solution to the situation. It is indeed disheartening to note that innocent children have been caught up in the middle of this armed conflict, and sadly, they will be the most adversely affected by the horrifying situation. As the war continues to affect social institutions, education has undeniably been one of the major casualties, leading to severe disruptions in the education of children. My delegation takes note of a report by the Ukrainian Ministry of Education and Science that 1,397 educational facilities across the country have been damaged and 102 destroyed by bombings and shelling as of 26 April 2022. In fact, the reported attacks on schools and other educational facilities across Ukraine may constitute gross violations of international humanitarian law, particularly against children. On this note, my delegation strongly condemns the bomb explosion of a school building in Luhansk, eastern Ukraine on 7th May, which resulted in significant civilian casualties, and we wish to commiserate with the bereaved families and the people of Ukraine. Ghana reiterates its call on all parties to refrain from attacking civilian infrastructure, especially those whose destruction impacts the lives of children. Mr. President, without the immediate cessation of hostilities, the 7.5 million children in Ukraine would continue to be endangered by the escalating armed conflict. It is very disheartening to see images of students forced to hide in basements and bomb shelters, and children missing months of schooling, which will certainly impact their future negatively. The persisting impunity and high-handedness against children, schools, and educational facilities in Ukraine must not only stop forthwith, but the perpetrators must be held accountable for their actions. In the meantime, Ghana is still hopeful that the war ends soon by peaceful and diplomatic means, so that teachers and students can return to their normal routines. In these difficult circumstances in Ukraine, the fact still remains that war is usually traumatic for children, especially when they are directly affected. The mental impact, especially on these children, is likely to have devastating consequences for several years to come. In this connection, humanitarian efforts should not only focus on the physical needs of the affected children in Ukraine, but also on their psychological needs and emotional assistance, as the damage of the war will result in long-lasting psychological trauma. My delegation reiterates that the mental well-being and safety of the children in Ukraine should be our utmost concern and should remain at the forefront of action of the international community, including this Council. At this juncture, we wish to commend the efforts of UNICEF and its partners in providing education-related supplies and appropriate learning opportunities for Ukrainian children in formal and informal settings. My delegation calls on host and transit countries to ensure that the best interest of children, including learning opportunities, is an essential element of their interventions. We believe that such interventions would minimize the enduring impact that the ongoing crisis will have in the lives of the children in Ukraine and their education. In the spirit of UN Resolution 2601, I would like to reaffirm Ghana's commitment to UN endeavors to protect the children in Ukraine, as well as its efforts aimed at ensuring uninterrupted education for the children. We encourage the continued deployment of the good offices of the Secretary General in the international endeavor to bring an end to the war and facilitate a diplomatic solution to the ongoing security and humanitarian crisis in Ukraine. In concluding, for the sake of the lives of the innocent children in Ukraine, we reiterate our call on the Russian Federation to heed the repeated calls of the international community to withdraw all its invading troops from the internationally recognized borders of Ukraine and pursue the path of dialogue and diplomacy. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Ghana for her statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Kenya.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank ASG, Madam Joyce Msuya, and Deputy ED, Mr. Omar Abdi, for their briefings. I also welcome the participation of the representatives of Ukraine, Estonia, Poland, and Slovakia. Mr. President, the humanitarian catastrophe in Ukraine is deeply disturbing. We do not think that it is inevitable that it should continue. But we fear that the Council is settling into a familiar tragic pattern. The military conflict is becoming a protracted affair in which the civilian population continues to suffer gravely. And rather than diplomacy, negotiation, and ceasefire being sought with ambition, far too much energy and attention are being used to make and defend accusations of violations of international humanitarian law. We are forced to restate the obvious, that our responsibility as the Security Council is to protect international peace and security. Of course, our efforts to advance the humanitarian aims in conflict are critically important. But the primary responsibility of the Council remains international peace and security. We must therefore urge the Council and all its members to make every effort to find a path to negotiating peace for Ukraine and its suffering people. A peace that respects and protects Ukraine's rights as a member state of the United Nations. The unfolding political situation in Europe, with alliances rapidly developing that may entrench differences, needs to be stabilized for the sake of international peace and security. If the Security Council and the international community truly embrace the preventive approach, then this is a priority. It is also the best guard against the humanitarian crisis that will emerge as a result of a broadening of the war in the future. President, in regard to the present humanitarian developments, Kenya condemns the recent attacks on civilian objects, including the reported bombing of a school in Luhansk that's believed to have been sheltering about 90 civilians. We again urge all parties to prioritize the protection of schools and other critical civilian infrastructure in accordance with international humanitarian law. We commend the Secretary General for his efforts that resulted in the recent round of evacuations to safety of more than 170 people that were trapped in the Azovstal steel plant and other areas of Mariupol. Mr. President, we must not forget that this war is impacting economies and vulnerable people around the world. The disruption of food and energy supply chain is compounding the food and energy insecurity, especially in fragile contexts, and driving millions deeper into poverty and humanitarian crisis. We therefore appeal for enhanced support for other humanitarian situations, particularly in the Global South. In line with the Secretary General's recommendations on the basis of assessments by his Global Crisis Response Group, states should resist export restrictions and make reserves available to countries with serious food insecurity. We urge states, UN agencies, and international financial institutions to urgently implement the Secretary General's recommendations. Time and boldness are of the essence if this war is not to lead to the escalation of multiple crises worldwide. Mr. President, in closing, we call on the parties to the war in Ukraine and their allies and partners to give more effort to achieving a meaningful cessation of hostilities. In the meantime, we strongly urge Ukraine and the Russian Federation to offer guarantees for safe humanitarian passages for trapped civilians, particularly in eastern Ukraine. I thank you for your attention.
I thank the representative of Kenya for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Norway.
Thank you, President. I thank the briefers for their grave accounts of the humanitarian situation in Ukraine. Again, Norway condemns in the strongest terms Russia's unprovoked war of aggression against Ukraine. It has created a humanitarian disaster, one which is the responsibility of Russia alone. The civilian suffering must end. The Council's joint expression of support last week to the Secretary General's effort to search for peaceful solutions is a first step towards this end. We need to see a path towards peace. President, the ongoing attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure in Ukraine is having a particularly devastating and unacceptable impact on children, their families, and communities. The use of heavy explosive weapons in populated areas is destroying homes, schools, and health centers, with children at an especially high risk for lethal and debilitating injuries, 7 times higher than for adults. And we condemn the use of anti-personnel mines and cluster munitions, weapons that will continue to kill and injure long after the conflict ends. The most recent attacks by Russia on schools and the civilians seeking shelter there demonstrate a blatant disrespect for international humanitarian law. These attacks are clearly in contradiction of Security Council Resolution 2601 on the protection of education in conflict, unanimously adopted by this Council just months ago. We call on all parties to protect and respect the civilian character of schools and educational facilities in accordance with international humanitarian law. Continuing education, even during armed conflict, is crucial, including for displaced children. Their right to education must be upheld. President, all Ukrainian children are affected by this war. Many are displaced across borders or internally in Ukraine. We are particularly concerned about the high number of children that are separated from their families. Unaccompanied children are in particularly vulnerable situations and are at risk of human trafficking and sexual violence and abuse. Access to child protective services is key, including child-appropriate mental health and psychosocial support. President, Norway is alarmed about the situation for the many civilians, including children, the elderly, and persons with disabilities who remain trapped in the battle zone. All civilians, including those in care institutions, must have access to humanitarian assistance and safe passage for voluntary evacuation to safety. We're appalled by the reports of involuntary evacuations, deportation, and so-called filtration camps. We're also deeply concerned about the increasing reports of conflict-related sexual violence, including against men and boys. It is of the utmost importance that all survivors are ensured sexual and reproductive health and rights. The atrocities committed during this war must be investigated, and those responsible must be held accountable, and we support the ongoing investigations. And we underline the importance of utilizing expertise on child protection, children's rights, and gender. In ensuring documentation and accountability, it is also important that the right to freedom of expression and free access to information is being vigorously defended. Journalists must be protected. President, I would like to conclude today by commending the humanitarian organizations who are working every day to mitigate the humanitarian consequences of this war, especially local civil society organizations which are doing a tremendous job. But to truly end this humanitarian crisis, the war must stop. Russia chose to invade Ukraine in breach of the UN Charter and international law. Russia must also stop the war and withdraw its troops from Ukraine immediately. And I thank you.
I thank the representative of Norway for her statement. And I now give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I'd like to start by thanking Ms. Masuya and Mr. Abdi for their helpful and informative briefings. Over the past 25 years, the Security Council has repeatedly recognized, condemned, and sought to address the impact of conflict on children. While it will take time for the UN's monitoring and reporting mechanism to establish the full extent of the impact on children of Russia's invasion, there is already evidence that Russia is committing 4 of the Security Council's 6 grave violations against children in times of war, listed in Security Council Resolution 1261. 1. Children have been killed and maimed. OHCHR reporting suggests that at least 238 children have been killed and 347 injured, although the true toll is likely to be far higher. 2. Schools and nurseries have been targeted across Ukraine, and, as with the tragic bombing of the Mariupol theatre, children sheltering have been mercilessly targeted. 3. There are credible allegations of sexual violence against children by Russian forces. And, as others have said, mass displacement has left children exposed to human trafficking and sexual exploitation. 4. Reports of forced deportations continue, with over 700,000 people, including many mothers and children, having been moved to Russia. There is now a very real risk of a lost generation and the continuation of a cycle of violence caused by Russia's invasion and the devastation it has created. To address this, we need to work together. First, we urge all countries to endorse and implement the 2016 Safe Schools Declaration, designed to protect education in armed conflict. Second, the international community must ensure that all credible allegations of crimes on the territory of Ukraine are investigated, including grave violations against children, whoever is accused of committing them. We support all efforts to improve our collective understanding of the situation on the ground through evidence and data collection and the work of the monitoring and reporting mechanism. Third, the UK is proud to continue to play a leading role in the humanitarian effort in Ukraine, delivering vital supplies and life-saving medical aid to those most in need, including children. But humanitarian support is not a solution to the suffering of children in Ukraine. Only the withdrawal of Russian troops and an end to Russia's war in Ukraine will end the cause of suffering. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for her statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Brazil.
Thank you. Mr. President, we thank the briefers of OCHA and UNICEF for their presentations. We also would like to thank France and Mexico for their initiative to discuss the impact of the conflict in Ukraine on children and education. Children in Ukraine, as elsewhere, must be protected from the harm of violence, and under no circumstances should they be subject to violations of international humanitarian law, international human rights law, and international refugee law. Brazil is deeply concerned with the continued reports of child casualties due to the use of explosive weapons, mining-related incidents, and explosive remnants of war. Both parties to the conflict must avoid the use of explosive weapons in densely populated areas, including near schools or universities or along routes to or from them. Schools and medical facilities should never be used for military purposes. It is of the utmost importance to implement Resolution 2601 on the protection of education, which Brazil co-sponsored last year. The Safe Schools Declaration, which we have also endorsed, provides important guidelines on this matter as well. In the face of conflict, children and their parents have to endure great challenges. There are reports of Ukrainian parents that, out of desperation, sent their children abroad with strangers. Authorities in neighboring countries have identified children as young as 4 and 5 years old crossing state borders alone or with barely familiar people. For them, family reunification should be pursued with great urgency. We cannot overestimate the impact of war in traumatized children. Furthermore, with the disruption of the school system countrywide, their studies are discontinued and compromised, with lasting impact to their personal development. As the conflict persists, the damage to children's education grows starker. The cessation of attacks against civilian infrastructures is key in protecting children from the harms of conflict. Resolution 2573 provides fundamental guidance for the protection of objects indispensable to survival of civilian population. Children forced to flee their homes to ensure their own survival are especially vulnerable. Brazil is concerned with the alarming number of children who became internally displaced persons and refugees. Support from the international community is needed more than ever, especially to those children who are unaccompanied or separated from their parents and family members. As they are forced into the condition of refugees or IDPs, children can become more vulnerable to crimes, including sexual violence and exploitation. Their physical integrity and well-being should be a priority to all member states. In line with our tradition of solidarity, Brazil has been granting humanitarian visas and residence permits for displaced Ukrainians and stateless persons affected or displaced by the armed conflict in Ukraine. Once in Brazilian territory, they have full access to all public services and social benefits on equal footing with Brazilian nationals. Brazilian civil society has been forthcoming in mobilizing to provide further specialized assistance to help local integration. Other Brazilian humanitarian actions include the donation of water purifiers, food, essential supplies, and medical items. We shall recommit our efforts to end this conflict and prevent the Ukrainians to have lost generations of children, victims of trauma, and without access to proper education. The silence of the guns and the withdrawal of troops may be not enough to end the war, but it would be the first glimmer of hope for the Ukrainians to resume their lives with peace. And I thank you.
I thank the representative of Brazil for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Ireland.
Thank you very much, President, and my thanks also to our briefers this morning, Assistant Secretary General Masuya and Deputy Executive Director Abbey. I want to thank you both for all the work done by you and your colleagues to help alleviate the suffering inflicted on the Ukrainian people by the Russian Federation's senseless and illegal war. Thank you again. President, shockingly, 2/3 of all children in Ukraine have had to flee their homes, many leaving behind parents and grandparents, all leaving behind the lives they knew. These children face the horrendous risks of abuse, trafficking, and exploitation. This is unconscionable. We have heard reports of children killed and maimed by indiscriminate attacks. We're also hearing chilling reports of sexual violence perpetrated by Russian soldiers, with children reportedly amongst those violated. That is abhorrent. We simply cannot accept such violations of international law causing this suffering and trauma, not in Ukraine, not anywhere in the world. These horrific violations must end, and those responsible will be held to account. President, as civilian infrastructure across Ukraine continues to be demolished by Russian forces, we must respond to the destruction of hundreds of schools, including kindergartens. Attacks on schools, in violation of international law, have profound impacts on the children affected. Let's remember, as in the case of killing, maiming, and sexual violence, attacks on schools and hospitals are listable under the CAC agenda. If this Council is to protect children in armed conflict and to seriously tackle impunity, we must support the integrity and impartiality of listing on these grounds. This Council recognised children's right to education in conflict with the unanimous adoption of Resolution 2601 just a few months ago. Are our memories really that short? Our words should be followed by actions. Collectively, we need to take action to address the disruption of education through the provision of education in emergency settings, psychosocial services, mental health support, and healthcare. It is clear that child protection capacities in Ukraine need to be urgently resourced. Insofar as possible, this Council should support UN monitors and child protection staff. Ireland calls on the Secretary-General and on Special Representative Gamba to consider adding Ukraine as a situation of concern in the upcoming annual reports on children and armed conflict, in order to further assist the extremely important monitoring work carried out by UN staff. Grave violations and abuses have been committed against children in eastern Ukraine since 2014, and now, with the alarming increase in violations since the further Russian invasion 2 months ago, we would fully expect to see this reflected in the next reports. We also call on the Secretary-General and SRSG Gamba to use all tools and mechanisms to address any CAC violations taking place in Ukraine and to deliver on accountability. President, the most innocent of victims, millions of Ukraine's children, are being robbed of their childhoods and of their future by this war. Denying children their right to education has profound impacts on their individual development, but also on the future of Ukrainian society as a whole. We continue to see the devastating impact of the use of explosive weapons in populated areas, including on schools. Now, and long after the conflict, the contamination of explosive remnants of war will have a disproportionate impact on the children of Ukraine, carrying risks of death or injury, further blighting their futures. Equally, robbing children of the possibility of routine vaccinations exposes them to critical outbreaks of communicable diseases, which can also have long-term debilitating consequences. The evacuations from Mariupol, negotiated by the Secretary-General and the UN, have shown that it is possible to do the right thing for civilians and that the humanitarian notification system can function. We must continue all our efforts to help the people of Ukraine. President, the reverberations of this war, we know, reach far beyond Ukraine's borders. We also know that they will reach beyond this generation. We all have a responsibility to support the people of Ukraine long after this war has ended. At this table, we have repeatedly called for the war to end, for the Russian Federation to withdraw its forces and to engage in true dialogue and diplomacy. However, while armed conflict continues, Russia must comply with its obligations under international law, including international humanitarian law. We will not tire of making this call. We must meet our responsibilities. The children of Ukraine deserve nothing less from us. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Ireland for her statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of China.
主席先生，我感谢莫苏亚助理秘书长和阿布迪副执行主任的通报。乌克兰的冲突让儿童承受着不属于他们年龄的痛苦，保护儿童免受伤害是冲突当事方必须履行的国际法义务。中方再次呼吁保障儿童和儿童赖以生存的基础设施安全，在人员疏散和人道救援行动中优先考虑儿童的需求。我们欢迎在联合国和红十字国际委员会协调下，受困在马里乌波尔亚速钢铁厂，包括儿童在内的平民得以安全疏散。希望俄罗斯和乌克兰继续就人道问题加大协调，全力减少冲突带来的人道影响。比洛霍里夫卡村一所学校于5月7日遭到袭击，并造成多人丧生，这样的事件令人痛惜。学校不应成为袭击目标，也不应被用作军事目的。事件情况和具体原因必须查清， 任何指控都应基于事实。主席先生，冲突持续2个多月来，已造成乌克兰1半以上儿童流离失所，数百万儿童进入邻国避难。中方赞赏乌克兰和周边国家以及联合国人道协调办公室、儿基会等人道机构为避难儿童提供的安全庇护、人道援助和心理支持，呼吁国际社会继续加大救援力度，确保每一个有需要的儿童都能获得有效救助。避难儿童，特别是失散和无人陪伴儿童，面临的人口贩运、性剥削和性虐待风险令人担忧。中方呼吁儿基会、难民署、毒罪办、人道高专办等机构加强监测，支持有关国家采取措施，预防和消除针对儿童的侵害行为。世卫组织关于儿童常规免疫机重受到干扰、麻疹等疫病爆发风险上升的警告，应当引起重视。中方支持世卫组织同乌克兰和有关国家开展合作，确保儿童能够按时获得疫苗接种。教育给冲突中的儿童以希望，也关乎乌克兰的未来。中方支持儿基会帮助乌克兰政府为境内流离失所儿童提供教育用品和学习机会，鼓励难民接受国将避难儿童的纳入本国教育系统，确保儿童受教育权不因冲突而中断。主席先生，实现和平是对儿童最好的保护。对话谈判是达成停火止战最现实可行的途径。国际社会应当鼓励俄罗斯和乌克兰重回谈判轨道，为恢复和平不断积累政治条件。中方欢迎安理会上周就乌克兰问题通过主席声明，呼吁以和平方式解决国际争端，支持秘书长为推动和平做出努力。制裁换不来和平，只会加速危机外溢，引发席卷全球的粮食、能源、金融危机，让世界各地的儿童承受制裁苦果。生活在阿富汗、也门、非洲之角、萨赫勒地区冲突局势下的儿童受到的人道冲击最大。中方再次呼吁各方保持理性克制，超越偏见纷争，为乌克兰危机早日解决，为儿童享有和平的未来做出不懈努力。谢谢主席先生。
I thank the representative of China for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the United Arab Emirates.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd also like to join others in thanking Assistant Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, Ms. Joyce Masuya, and Deputy Executive Director of UNICEF, Mr. Omar Abdi, for their valuable briefings. As we heard from today's briefers, the extent of devastation due to the war in Ukraine does not appear to have reached its limits, and its impact is disproportionately affecting children. Well over half of Ukraine's 7.5 million children have been displaced as a result of the conflict, and there are also deeply disturbing reports of hundreds of children having been killed and maimed since the conflict began that should be investigated. War is always deeply traumatizing, particularly for children, and this conflict is no exception, and there is a dire need for essential services such as education and healthcare to be provided urgently and to continue throughout the course of the conflict. We know too well from our own region and beyond the costs of conflict on children and their education, from children in Syria that have been denied an education for more than a decade, to Palestinian children facing continued disruptions to their schooling, to girls in Afghanistan who've been denied secondary education since August 2021, to children in Yemen, Libya, the Horn of Africa, and Sahel, and countless more examples from around the globe. There is a lost generation of children and youth who simply will never regain a meaningful opportunity to learn. The children of Ukraine could face that same fate while this armed conflict continues, and we therefore, like others, urge all diplomatic efforts to end it. And it is crucial that we redouble our commitment to ensure educational access in Ukraine, where the conflict has already significantly disrupted children's access to education. And this comes on top of the COVID-19 pandemic-related disruptions that had already negatively impacted children's lives before the conflict had even begun. As the international community responds to the urgent humanitarian needs in Ukraine, education must be a priority. And it is also critical to ensuring that future generations have the necessary skills to effectively contribute to their communities. So we must think about the period after the conflict as much as the period through it. As UNICEF recalled, children will have a much better chance to recover if they can quickly return to schools and to some form of normalcy in their lives. And so in light of all of these difficult realities, I'd like to focus on the following points. First, we remain deeply concerned by reports of the ongoing damage and destruction of civilian infrastructure, including health and educational facilities. The bombing of the school in Bilhorivka over this past weekend is one disturbing example. And UNICEF has noted that at least 1 in every 6 UNICEF-supported schools in eastern Ukraine has been damaged in the course of the conflict. We underline the importance of protecting educational facilities and ensuring continued access to education. Second, facilitating access to education, particularly for refugee children, is imperative in supporting children's development and maintaining a sense of stability in their lives. We commend the neighboring host countries, as well as UNICEF and UNESCO, for facilitating the continuation of educational services, including through providing equipment that supports online teaching, in addition to expanding digital education platforms. Such efforts are invaluable and must be supported by the international community. Furthermore, distance learning can mitigate some of the disruptive effects of the conflict, and we've noted that 12,600 schools providing education to nearly 4 million students are now operating remotely. Third, providing psychosocial services is critical to ensuring children's well-being during and after the war. Children have been uprooted from their homes and separated from caregivers. Many children have witnessed or experienced violence, included reported sexual violence, and all credible reports should be investigated. We commend UNHCR and UNICEF for their support for the provision of psychosocial services to children, as well as their efforts to particularly help children with disabilities. Finally, we reiterate our call on all parties to abide by their obligations under international humanitarian law, and we further underline that the protection of children and all civilians can only be assured with the cessation of hostilities throughout Ukraine and the reaching of a diplomatic solution to this conflict. This is not only essential for the children of Ukraine, but all children globally living through years of armed conflict. None of these children should be neglected by the Security Council. The reverberating impact of this conflict, including through the rise of food and commodity prices, will fall heaviest on the health and development of children. In this vein, we call on both sides to remain committed, despite the difficulties, to dialogue, and for the international community and this Council to support efforts to end the conflict and establish a process for peace. We are encouraged by the Secretary General's efforts in this regard and OCHA's feedback to this Council that recent efforts to evacuate hundreds of civilians in Mariupol have shown the goodwill that exists on both sides and are grounds to build upon. We must build on that opportunity and double down our efforts to support these initiatives. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United Arab Emirates for her statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Господин председатель, приветствуем на заседании заместителя исполнительного директора ЮНИСЕФ Омара Абди, заместителя главы ОКГВ Джойс Мсуя. Внимательно выслушали их доклады. Сегодня ряд делегаций говорили на темы иные, чем дети и образование, которые заявлены в качестве темы сегодняшнего заседания, поэтому я не буду реагировать на это, а сосредоточусь на детях и образовании. Полагаем, что тема сегодняшнего заседания более чем актуальна, потому что в фокусе нашего внимания не только дети, но и образование, их образование, на фундаменте которого формируется их личность. Вот уже более 8 лет на Украине киевский режим ведет гражданскую войну против своего народа. То, какие планы были у майданной власти в отношении детей Донбасса, стало понятно после слов бывшего президента Украины Петра Порошенко, сказанных в 2014 году в отношении жителей Донбасса, граждан Украины, своих граждан. Цитирую: «У нас будет работа, у них нет. У нас поддержку людей, детей и пенсионеров будет, у них нет. У нас дети пойдут в школы и детские сады, а у них они будут сидеть по подвалам. Вот так, именно так мы выиграем эту войну». Конец цитаты. Порошенко это свое обещание, в отличие от многих других, сдержал. Киевские власти своими обстрелами действительно не давали донбасским детям выйти из подвалов. Под прицельным огнем украинских военных находились школы, больницы, детские площадки, а также ключевые объекты инфраструктуры. Вот только наши западные коллеги по политическим причинам предпочитали этого не замечать. За эти 8 лет в результате обстрелов ВСУ на Донбассе погибло свыше 100 детей. У жителей Донбасса есть традиция нести цветы на аллею ангелов, памятнику детям, погибшим от рук украинских военных, поднявших оружие против своего народа. Туда же сегодня в воспитательных целях отводят многих украинских военнопленных с тем, чтобы они осознали, с кем они на самом деле воевали все эти годы. За период с 2014 по 2022 год только в Луганской Народной Республике зафиксировано более 200 фактов повреждения объектов образования, почти половину из которых составляют школы и детские сады. Уже этой весной в Донбассе под украинскими снарядами вновь гибнут дети. Растет и число сирот, родители которых погибают от обстрелов украинской армии. Россия помогает дончанам и луганчанам, чем может. В нашу страну, по данным на начало мая, прибыло более 215 тысяч детей. Часть из них приехали со своими опекунами и законными представителями. А из интернатов ДНР и ЛНР приехало порядка 1200 детей. Мы тесно взаимодействуем с властями ДНР и ЛНР в вопросах усыновления детей-сирот. В интересах детей задействуется такой институт, как временная опека, позволяющий временно разместить их в российских семьях. Направляем гуманитарную помощь детям в Донбассе. Что касается детей-беженцев, то организуем процесс устройства детей в школы, при этом задействуем все варианты. Обычные школы, надомные, инклюзивные и дистанционное обучение. Господин председатель, российские вооруженные силы прилагают все усилия для обеспечения безопасности детей в ходе специальной военной операции на Украине. Мы решительно осуждаем нарушение норм международного гуманитарного права, особенно совершенные в отношении детей. Считаем недопустимыми как преднамеренные нападения на детей и другие категории лиц, пользующихся защитой, так и неизбирательное или чрезмерное применение силы и использование школ в военных целях. Сегодня мы в очередной раз услышали от ряда коллег обвинения в адрес российских военных в совершении актов насилия, включая сексуальное, в отношении детей. Это прозвучало, в частности, у моей британской коллеги, но не только. Мало того, что эти обвинения абсурдны, хотел бы в этой связи сослаться на первоисточник. В интервью компании «Белсат» уполномоченная президента Украины по правам ребенка Дарья Герасимчук сказала следующее: у Генпрокуратуры Украины нет ни единого подобного подтвержденного факта. Многие здания и учреждения образования в городах, где ведутся активные боевые действия, использовались украинскими военными в качестве опорных пунктов, из-за чего получили значительные повреждения. У нас складывается стойкое впечатление, что нормы международного гуманитарного права существуют для кого угодно, но только не для Киева. Занятия школ, детских садов и иных детских учебных заведений вооруженными силами Украины является не исключением, а правилом. Такой бесчеловечный метод ведения вооруженных действий ставит под угрозу жизнь детей, лишает их права на образование и разрушает образовательную инфраструктуру Украины. Намеренные разрушения гражданских объектов являются визитной карточкой Киева. И это не российская пропаганда, как тут некоторым хочется верить. 6 мая мы провели неформальное заседание Совета Безопасности ООН по формуле «Ария», где дали слово не только независимым иностранным журналистам, но и простым жителям двух республик. Они, не скрывая эмоций, рассказывали, как псевдогеройский батальон «Азов» у них на глазах расстреливал мирное население, в том числе автобусы с детьми, пытавшимися эвакуироваться из зон боевых действий. Как эти молодчики выгоняли людей из своих квартир, а раненых из больниц. Как они занимали детские сады и школы, организовывали там свои ночлежки и склады для хранения оружия и боеприпасов. Таких свидетельств масса, и мы их тщательно документируем. Действия киевских властей бросают тени на другие документы мягкого права в области защиты школы и образования. Речь идет, в частности, о Декларации о безопасных школах, документе, не являющемся юридически обязательным, но о важности которого так часто любят говорить наши западные партнеры. И что мы видим? Украина, которая вроде как публично приняла на себя обязательства по данному документу, абсолютно его игнорирует. Тем самым действия Украины не только создают риск для детей, которыми вооруженные силы Украины прикрываются, как живым щитом, но происходит девальвация ценностей указанного документа. Кстати сказать, свою готовность рассматривать действующие школы в качестве целей Украина демонстрирует не только на своей территории на Донбассе. Вчера, например, обстрелу подверглась школа в селе Солохи Белгородской области на территории Российской Федерации. Хотели бы обратить внимание на еще один важный аспект. Украинские националисты, и в частности боевики печально известного полка «Азов», вот уже много лет занимаются вербовкой детей в вооруженные силы Украины и воспитанием в духе ненависти ко всему русскому. В этих целях в ряде регионов Украины были образованы детские лагеря, куда принимали детей с 7 до 18 лет. Одним из таких учреждений стал детский приют «Пилигрим» в городе Мариуполь, в котором из детей готовили будущих боевиков. Другим подобным учреждением стала организация украинской молодежи «Центурия». Основой ее идеологии – радикальный украинский национализм. Репортажи о подготовке детей и солдат появлялись неоднократно, в том числе и на западном телевидении, еще до начала специальной военной операции России на Украине. В 2018 году журналисты Associated Press на Украине стали свидетелями того, как подростков детского лагеря «Азовец» учат, цитирую, «уничтожать нелюдей». Журналисты США испытали культурный шок. Господин председатель, поскольку наша дискуссия сегодня касается образования, я хотел бы коснуться качества детского образования на Украине, которое киевский режим последовательно затачивал под свои идеологические установки. Проведенный нами анализ более 300 украинских школьных учебников и пособий подтвердил целенаправленную работу по выстраиванию цепочки, искажающей историю и историческую правду. Я даже не говорю о том, что в качестве героев детям представляли фашистских коллаборационистов. Я говорю о том, что современное украинское образование имеет целью изначально настраивать украинскую молодежь с самых ранних возрастов против России. Причем образ врага из нашей страны начали лепить давно. А за послемайданные годы для образовательной системы киевского режима стало нормальным выпускать для школьников материалы, обучающие использованию огнестрельного оружия против сепаратистов и оккупантов. Тотальной украинизацией учебного процесса и переписыванием совместных страниц истории русского и украинского народов занимается Министерство образования и науки Украины. В 2016 году это ведомство, цитирую, с учетом исторических событий последних лет, конец цитаты, утвердило 25 учебных программ. Наиболее масштабной корректировке подверглись программы по истории и географии. Я даже захватил с собой учебник географии для 8 класса под редакцией Масляка и Капирулина. Если верить ему, то предки французов, испанцев, португальцев, турок и даже евреев пришли с Украины. Хочу обратиться к своему французскому коллеге. Николя, вы знали, что вы на самом деле украинец? Не верите, почитайте учебник. Я взял это оттуда. В нем железная логика. Поскольку предки французов это галлы, то они пришли из Галичины, которая на Украине. А знаете ли вы, что, по мнению автора учебника, украинцы и поляки имеют славянское происхождение, а русские – уграфинское? Отказано в славянстве белорусам, их отнесли к балтийским народам. В учебнике «История Украины» для 7 класса под общей редакцией Ляха и Тимировой говорится, что Становление украинского народа насчитывает 140 тысяч лет. В учебнике по истории для 9 класса под редакцией Турченко и Марокко утверждается, что к концу XVIII века украинцы в то время были одним из самых крупных народов в Европе. Здесь стоит упомянуть, что галичанец, автор книги «Украинская нация», вообще убежден, что, цитирую, «население Восточной Европы вошло в первое тысячелетие новой эры под названием украинцы». Конец цитаты. И это при том, что украинцами жители территорий, входящих в современную Украину, как известно, никто не называл. Даже в творчестве чтимого на Украине и в России поэта Тараса Шевченко, жившего в середине XIX века, термин «украинцы» полностью отсутствует. Жители этих всех земель называли русинами, русскими или, в крайнем случае, малорусами. Но я не буду вдаваться в эту неприятную для моего украинского коллеги тему. Благо, абсурдных примеров из украинской школьной программы и учебной литературы хватает. Есть, например, на Украине такой историк Валерий Бебик, и он такой не один. Так вот, он утверждает, что Константинополь был колонией Херсонеса на территории современного Севастополя, а прародитель скифов – это уроженец Крыма Геракл, чьи корни исходят с острова Хортица на Днепре. Название города Мена на Черниговщине, оказывается, дало имя первому египетскому фараону Менесу, а само украинское государство, по его подсчетам, существует более 7,5 тысяч лет. Знаменитого монгольского полководца, жившего в XII-XIII веках, как убежден пан Бебик, Чингисхана, оказывается, на самом деле звали Богданом. Не верите? Тогда автор советует вам ознакомиться с тайной историей монголов, где Чингисхана именует Богда-ханом. Ну и из этого понятно, что никакой он не монгол, а истинный украинец. Тем более, что воевал он, как он уверен, с украинским трезубом и под жовто-блакитными знаменами. Ну и, наконец, его главный вывод. Украина вообще является колыбелью мировой цивилизации, и даже Иисус Христос, не исключает Бебик, в одном из своих интервью, мог быть галичанином. Это не шутки. Я цитирую его интервью. Кто-то из вас может спросить, почему я уделяю столько внимания этому деятелю. Мало ли в наших странах сумасшедших, продвигающих маргинальные и весьма спорные исторические теории? Конечно, немало. Таковые есть и в России. Но есть один нюанс. Валерий Бебик не рядовой, а заслуженный сумасшедший и предводитель других сумасшедших псевдоисториков. В 2015 году, когда Порошенко заявил, что стране срочно необходимо создать специальное Министерство информационной политики, а по сути Министерство правды или Министерство лжи, как кому будет угодно, временным председателем Общественного совета при этом ведомстве был назначен как раз Валерий Бебик, ставший по сути главным историком Украины. Более того, этот человек неоднократно выдвигался на национальную премию Украины имени Тараса Шевченко, государственную награду за весомый вклад в развитие культуры и искусства. Решение о ее присуждении принимает лично президент Украины за произведение, цитирую, которое является высшим духовным достоянием украинского народа, приумножает историческую память и самобытность народа. Конец цитаты. Так что выходит, он никакой не маргинал, а по сути отец современной украинской историографии. Господин председатель, мы рассчитываем, что в конце концов у украинских детей наконец появится возможность продолжить обучение по нормальной школьной программе и не впитывать тот бред, который украинские власти насаждают детям. Благодарю вас.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Gabon.
Merci. Je remercie Madame Joyce Msuya et Monsieur Omar Abdi pour leurs exposés respectifs et je remercie la France et le Mexique pour l'initiative de ce briefing sur la situation humanitaire en Ukraine, axé sur la situation que vivent les enfants dans le contexte de la guerre. Monsieur le Président, la situation humanitaire en Ukraine empire au fil des combats. À ce jour, près de 14 millions de personnes ont été forcées à se déplacer depuis le début de la guerre en Ukraine. La moitié des réfugiés ou personnes déplacées sont des enfants. Que ces déplacements se fassent dans d'autres villes d'Ukraine, dans les pays voisins ou dans des contrées plus lointaines, ils demeurent une source de traumatisme et de détresse. Les femmes et les enfants, qui font partie des plus grands contingents de civils qui fuient les zones de combat, sont aussi ceux qui payent le prix le plus élevé des conséquences de la guerre. Parmi les enfants qui ont quitté l'Ukraine depuis le 24 février dernier, un certain nombre sont des mineurs non accompagnés, ce qui augmente leur risque d'être sujets à toutes sortes d'abus, de trafic ou d'exploitation. Ces fragilités sont exacerbées par les difficultés quotidiennes inhérentes aux pénuries d'eau, des difficultés d'accès aux soins et à l'énergie. Les statistiques du HCR concernant les enfants tués ou blessés durant les combats, en particulier dans les régions de l'Est et de l'Ouest de l'Ukraine, font froid dans le dos. Nous appelons une fois de plus les belligérants au respect du droit international humanitaire. Les civils, et en particulier les enfants, mais aussi les personnels humanitaires ne devraient jamais être visés par les tirs. Nous demandons également aux parties à faciliter le déploiement de l'aide humanitaire partout où les populations en ont besoin, sans entrave et sans discrimination. Monsieur le Président, la situation des enfants nécessite la plus grande attention de la communauté internationale afin d'atténuer les conséquences de la guerre dans leur quotidien, notamment en matière de scolarisation, où il est important de permettre à ces derniers de poursuivre leur cursus scolaire. Nous savons gré à l'UNICEF de l'inventivité dont elle a su faire preuve pour continuer de scolariser les enfants victimes de la guerre dans les pays d'accueil, en mettant notamment en place des classes provisoires, l'apprentissage à distance ou en organisant des activités d'apprentissage éducatives ou récréatives. Je voudrais aussi féliciter de façon particulière tous les pays qui ont accueilli des réfugiés et qui ont mis en place les conditions permettant de scolariser dans l'urgence les enfants réfugiés venant d'Ukraine. Nous saluons les actions de l'UNICEF qui s'acquitte de son mandat envers les enfants en Ukraine en direction des familles et des enfants en vue de pourvoir aussi bien aux besoins d'hygiène, de soins de santé primaires ou spécialisés, y compris les soins psychosociaux et de santé mentale, qu'en renforçant la sécurité de ces derniers. Nous sommes également reconnaissants à toutes les agences spécialisées des Nations Unies déployées sur le terrain des opérations et encourageons leurs actions conjointes avec l'UNICEF pour limiter les traumatismes des enfants victimes de la guerre. Nous avons pris note des statistiques du dernier rapport du HCR concernant les enfants enregistrés dans les centres dédiés et de la mise en place de points bleus destinés notamment à l'information des familles dans les lieux d'accueil et de tous les mécanismes qui sont en train de continuer d'être déployés dans le but de renforcer la protection des familles et des enfants. Il est primordial de limiter au maximum les possibilités pour les réseaux mafieux de profiter du désarroi de ces derniers. Monsieur le Président, à côté des actions de terrain qui visent à répondre à l'urgence humanitaire critique, les discussions doivent se poursuivre en parallèle en vue d'une résolution politique de la situation avec pour objectif de mettre fin à la guerre. C'est la plus grande action qui puisse être faite en faveur des enfants pour qui nous nous réunissons aujourd'hui. L'issue ne peut être trouvée que par le dialogue. C'est pourquoi mon pays appelle une fois de plus les parties à saisir toutes les opportunités pour renouer le dialogue. Nous appelons à un engagement ferme pour le retour de la paix et de la sécurité en Ukraine. Je vous remercie.
I thank the representative of Gabon for her statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of India.
Thank you, Mr. President. Let me begin by thanking the briefers from OCHA and UNICEF for their insights on the humanitarian situation in Ukraine, but particularly on the impact of the conflict on children and education. We have carefully noted the points made by them. Children constitute a third of humanity, the most important third, as they are our future. They are also the most vulnerable to suffering, particularly in situations of armed conflict, and therefore need additional protection and care. The conflict in Ukraine is no doubt severely impacting the 7.5 million children across Ukraine. While the protection of the rights of the child, including their access to education, is the primary responsibility of national government, the international community has the obligation to do its utmost to provide succor to children affected by this conflict. India is a signatory to the Convention on the Rights of the Child and appreciative of the ongoing efforts, including that of UNICEF, to alleviate the suffering of the children. We also support UNICEF efforts to scale up its operations. The conflict has also forced more than 5 million people to take shelter in the neighboring countries, and another 7.1 million are displaced within Ukraine. Out of these, women and children constitute the majority. We commend the efforts by the neighboring countries of Ukraine who have welcomed refugees from Ukraine, and especially for treating women and children with compassion and dignity. As a country which has welcomed refugees over centuries, India knows the importance and value of treating them equally and with dignity and catering to their needs and requirements. The impact of situation on children, on education of children, has also been severe. It has further aggravated the pandemic-related challenges that children were already facing. There are reports that more than 900 education facilities and schools have either been damaged or destroyed in Ukraine. The efforts of the government of Ukraine to protect schools and other learning spaces, students and children, teachers, to ensure uninterrupted education for children needs unequivocal support of the international community. Let us not forget the situation has also affected foreign students, including those from India. India facilitated safe return of 22,500 Indian nationals, most of them students studying in various universities in Ukraine. We are exploring options to minimize the impact of our students' education. We appreciate the relaxations made by the government of Ukraine for this academic year in respect of medical students. India has been sending humanitarian supplies to Ukraine and its neighbors, which include medicines and other essential relief material. Just last week, a further tranche of aid, including essential medicines and medical equipment, were handed over to the Ukrainian side. We support calls for guarantees of safe passage to deliver essential humanitarian and medical supplies, including through establishment of humanitarian corridors. We hope the international community will continue to respond positively to the evolving humanitarian requirements. The food security challenges emanating from the conflict requires us to respond by going beyond constraints that bind us presently. Energy security is equally a serious concern and needs to be addressed through cooperative efforts. We acknowledge the efforts made by the Secretary General, particularly the findings of Global Crisis Response Group Task Team. While responding positively to the evolving humanitarian requirements is an obligation and responsibility of the international community, it is in our collective interest to work constructively both within the United Nations and outside towards seeking an early solution to the conflict. Since the beginning of the Ukrainian conflict, India has stood for peace, dialogue, and diplomacy. We believe that no solution can be arrived at by shedding blood and at the cost of innocent lives, especially those of women and children. Allow me to reiterate the importance of UN guiding principles of humanitarian assistance once again. Humanitarian action must always be guided by the principles of humanitarian assistance, that is humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence. These measures should not be politicized. In conclusion, Mr. President, we continue to reiterate that the global order is anchored in international law, the UN Charter, and respect for the territorial integrity and sovereignty of states. I thank you.
I thank the representative of India for his statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of the United States. Thank you, Assistant Secretary General Masuya and Deputy Executive Director Abdi, for your very insightful briefings, which provide the Council and the watching global community an opportunity to hear of the immense suffering that has resulted from this unnecessary and brutal war, especially the suffering Russia is inflicting on children in Ukraine. Your briefings underscore what all of us who do not live in Russia, have seen on our screens and in the media for the last 2.5 months. Children in Ukraine have been displaced, hurt, orphaned, or killed. Of the nearly 14 million people forced to flee their homes since the conflict escalated, approximately half are innocent children. Children who deserve a chance to live, grow, and thrive, but instead are struggling every day to survive in horrific circumstances. The danger to children is only increasing. Growing numbers of hospitals and schools have been destroyed, as we're hearing. In the first 5 weeks since the February 24th invasion, an average of 22 schools were struck every day. Since this war began, there has been more than 200 attacks on healthcare facilities and schools. We heard news this past weekend, as other members have mentioned, of a bomb hitting a school in the eastern Ukrainian town of Bilohorivka. It killed as many as 60 people, including many children. And reliable reports indicate that when first responders arrived at the school to assist victims of the bombing, Russia's forces opened fire on them. We've all seen devastating and gruesome images of mass graves. There are reports of individuals executed en masse, bodies marked with unequivocal signs of torture, and now we are hearing more and more horrific accounts of sexual violence against women and girls, as well as boys and LGBTQ persons. The United States is particularly concerned about the situation in Kherson, where Russian forces have reportedly removed local officials and installed an illegitimate pro-Russian puppet administration. In recent days, these illegitimate proxies have increasingly indicated an intention to petition Russia to annex Kherson. Russia is clearly seeking to assimilate these regions into its orbit, and for the children of Kherson, this would have grave consequences. For example, schools would be forced to adopt the Russian curriculum with the goal of trying to erase all signs of Ukrainian adult identity or Ukrainian culture. In addition to fearing every waking day for their lives and safety, displacement poses particular risks for children. They become increasingly vulnerable to human trafficking and other forms of exploitation and abuse. This is even more acute for those children who are unaccompanied or have been separated from their parents or caregivers. Ukrainians have reportedly been deported to Russia and processed through so-called filtration camps, many of them children. Meanwhile, Russia's Commissioner for Children's Rights, Maria Lvova-Belova, has touted efforts to fast-track the adoption of children from Ukraine within Russia. Children are being exposed to extreme violence, fear, and anxiety. This can have major psychological effects on children that will impact for generations. Unless appropriate support is provided, the trauma associated with these experiences can have serious and enduring negative consequences on their cognitive development for years to come. Many on this council have just now called for diplomacy to resolve this crisis. We agree that diplomacy and dialogue are essential to resolve this crisis, and Russia should show its commitment to pursuing a peaceful resolution by silencing the guns and withdrawing its forces from Ukraine. We call again on Russia to end its war on Ukraine and to abide by its obligations under international humanitarian law, including those regarding taking feasible precautions to avoid and to minimize harm to civilians, including children. Additionally, all parties to the conflict should urgently facilitate safe and unhindered access for medical and humanitarian workers and supplies in order to ensure the provision of necessary humanitarian assistance and allow safe passage for those seeking to flee, including children. We join others in calling on the UN Secretary General and the Special Representative of the Secretary General for Children in Armed Conflict to add Ukraine as a situation of concern in the upcoming annual report on children in armed conflict. Given the scale and nature of reported violations and abuses committed by Russia against children in eastern Ukraine between 2014 and 2021, and the evidence of alarming increases in violations and abuses by Russia across Ukraine since February 2022, the situation warrants a place in the report. The international community has an obligation to protect children, as almost all of us around the table have said. Children, who are the most vulnerable among us. Member states should work collectively to ensure that innocent children, regardless of the borders in which they reside, can live without imminent fear of death, shelling, and lifelong trauma. Let us do our part. Let us not forget the children of Ukraine. Thank you. I now resume my function as President of the Council. I would like to again draw the attention of speakers to paragraph 22 of Note 507, which encourages all participants in Council meetings to deliver their statements in 5 minutes or less, in line with the Security Council's commitment to making more effective use of open meetings. I will now give the floor to the representative of Ukraine.
Well, thank you, Mr. President. Distinguished members of the Security Council. I also recognize the representatives of Putin's regime in the permanent seat of the Soviet Union. Perhaps as defendants in a future trial for war crimes and crimes against humanity, they should avail of this session as pretrial hearings. First of all, I would like to thank Assistant Secretary General Joyce Msuya and UNICEF Deputy Executive Director Omar Abdi for their briefings. Dear colleagues, admiration and pain, the sentiments of all those who are now watching Azovstal, Mariupol. Courageous defenders hold their positions under full blockade without any replenishments. Another day, another week, another month. Every day and night, the Russian occupiers try to break the resistance of the Ukrainians in Azovstal. Every day and night, they drop heavy aerial bombs. They shell the facilities with heavy artillery and multiple launch rocket systems. Assault groups of the Russian infantry are attacking non-stop. The defenders of Mariupol have already done the impossible. They stopped the overwhelming Russian troops for more than 3 months. Their contribution to the disruption of the Russian blitzkrieg plans can't be overestimated. Mariupol has paid a heavy price for this. The death toll among its residents over these months, about 20,000, is double the amount cost during the Second World War by German Nazis, who killed 10,000. That is the reason for the attackers to show no restraint in their attempts to finally crush the resistance. That is the reason why we are extremely concerned about the destiny of the defenders of Azovstal should they fall into the hands of the Russian troops. Even during the evacuation of civilians from Azovstal on the 7th of May, the Russian forces continued to shell the Ukrainian soldiers. As a result, 3 Ukrainian servicemen were killed and 6 were wounded in violation of all agreed arrangements. Many in Azovstal have been heavily wounded and they have no access to the medical treatment they urgently need. Therefore, we consider that the evacuation operation should be continued. We call on the Security Council and the Secretary General to invest further efforts to ensure the evacuation of the sick and wounded from the Azovstal area in accordance with international humanitarian law. They have to be brought to safe places where their right to life will be guaranteed. Russian captivity is not such a place for the servicemen from Azovstal. We are also alarmed that the repressive Russian practice of using filtration camps for Ukrainians fleeing dangerous areas is being consolidated further. Given the inhumane conditions and ill treatment, the word filtration can only be considered as euphemism for concentration. It is outrageous that Russia has applied these filtration practices to civilians who were evacuated from Azovstal under the facilitation of the United Nations and the ICRC. Some of them were illegally detained. For instance, during the evacuation on May 9, ironically on Mother's Day, the Russian occupiers separated a 4-year-old girl, Alice, from her mother, a medical worker. Only the little child was allowed to leave the occupied territory, while her mother was reported to be detained in a filtration camp. These actions by the Russian forces constitute a gross violation of child's right to life and security, guaranteed by the Hague and Geneva Conventions on the UN Convention and the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. We demand Russia immediately and unconditionally release the child's mother and ensure she is reunited with her daughter. We call on UNICEF to use all possible means to protect the rights of this child and other children who were separated from their parents by the Russians. Mr. President, the statement by the President of the Security Council on May 6 serves as another example. Immediately after the Russian Federation joined the members of the Security Council in recalling the obligation of all member states to settle their disputes by peaceful means, it fired rockets on Ukraine's Odessa and Mykolaiv, Kharkiv, and Zaporizhia regions. Russia continues its missile terror on a daily basis, targeting mostly civilian infrastructure. Since the 24th of February, Russia has fired more than 2,100 missiles on Ukrainian cities and villages. Women and children throughout Ukraine remain the most vulnerable groups under the conditions of the missile terror of Russia. Dear colleagues, at least 226 children have been killed and 417 wounded by the Russian troops in Ukraine. There is no doubt that the actual data is much higher, as the occupied territory remains a no-go zone for any credible international mechanisms. Every day of the Russian invasion of Ukraine brings us new tragedies and new crimes committed by Russians. One of the most recent cases happened in the village of Bilohorivka, the Lugansk region, on the 7th of May. Following a Russian airstrike on a local school, the only building with a shelter, only 30 civilians out of 90 were rescued. The school, once full of joyful children, was turned by Russian pilot into another mass grave. Last night, Russia carried out an airstrike on Novgorod-Siversky, destroying another school. As of today, about 130 educational institutions have been entirely destroyed and more than 1,500 have been damaged. I reiterate that schools must never be attacked or used for military purposes. Targeting civilians and civilian objects, including schools, is a violation of international humanitarian law. Mr. President, in violation of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, Russia continues its kidnapping of Ukrainian children. After forcible transfer to Russia, they are illegally adopted by Russian citizens without observing any of the mandatory procedures envisaged by the legislation of Ukraine. According to official Russian sources, on May 7th, more than 1 million Ukrainians have been transferred to Russia, including 200,000 children. 2,000 of them are orphans or those deprived of paternal care. The children's living conditions and their state of health remain unknown. We call on UNICEF, UNHCR, and ICRC to demand from Russia immediate and unhindered access to those children, as well as to all persons who have been transferred from conflict-affected areas of Ukraine to Russia or Ukrainian territories under temporary Russian control. We also call on the Secretary General to use all the mechanisms established by the Council to monitor and report on violations against children in conflict. Mr. President, according to the WHO, at least 3,000 people have died in Ukraine during the period of the invasion due to the lack of access to treatment of chronic diseases. The Health Ministry of Ukraine reported that as of today, Russian troops have destroyed or damaged about 400 healthcare facilities. Under the circumstances of war, the treatment of cancer patients have been completely stopped in Ukraine. There are serious problems with access to insulin and antibiotics. The situation with access to medical services in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine in the east and south can only be described as a disaster. There is a storage of the most basic drugs. The UN Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities estimates that Russia's military attacks against Ukraine are putting the lives of 2.7 million people with disabilities at risk. Distinguished colleagues, we welcome the launch of the Commission of Inquiry to investigate the atrocities related to Russia's war against Ukraine. The resolution adopted today in Geneva mandates the Commission to conduct a special investigation into war crimes committed by Russian invaders in areas of Kiev, Chernihiv, Kharkiv, and Sumy regions. The list includes arbitrary executions of more than 1,000 civilians, widespread instances of sexual violence, torture, and other violations. Ukraine, together with up to 50 partner countries, will ensure accountability for all perpetrators. Mr. President, it is symbolic that one of the Russian rockets launched on May 7th destroyed the Museum of Ukrainian philosopher Grigory Skovoroda. In his doctrine, he promoted humanistic ideas. Indeed, the current Russia is too far from humanism. The recent saber-rattling celebration of the 9th of May served as another illustration. The entire world commemorates on the 8th of May the memory of victims and those who stopped the Nazism 77 years ago under the motto, "Never again." Russia has made the day of the 9th of May a cornerstone of its ideology, which is a combination of a propaganda war, hatred towards neighbors, militarization, and utmost disregard for agreed rules, norms, and values. We are grateful to all member states that co-sponsored the joint statement on the occasion of the 77th anniversary of the end of the Second World War in Europe, and thus demonstrated their resolute stance towards cynical attempts to appropriate and exploit the memory of the victory over Nazism and to use it for justifying this full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Listening to Putin nowadays, one can hardly believe he is the same person who once wrote in his op-ed for the New York Times that, I quote, "The law is still the law, and we must follow it whether we like it or not," wrote Putin 9 years ago. He also wrote, I quote, "Under current international law, force is permitted only in self-defense or by the decision of the Security Council. Anything," Putin wrote, "anything else is unacceptable under the UN Charter and would constitute an act of aggression," end of quote. Edition for September 11, 2013, under the title, "A Plea for Caution from Russia." 9 years ago, Russian diplomatic vocabulary still contained the word caution. And according to Putin's op-ed, Russia's current actions against Ukraine should be considered as act of aggression. Because nobody attacked Russia, because no single decision has been adopted by the Security Council to sanction Russian actions in Ukraine. If it was not so tragic, it could have been funnier and much deeper fake than deep fake Putin videos on Trevor Snow's daily show. In fact, they are much closer to reality than Putin's envoy speaking here. Not long after Putin's hypercritical op-ed about supremacy of international law, in March 2014, the late Putin's envoy Churkin at least made an effort to keep up appearances in this council, trying to find at least some justification to Russian invasion of Ukraine. Today's standards of Russian diplomacy have gone through the floor, and all masks off. Russia is the only beneficiary of the Council's inactions on the issue of its war against Ukraine. At the same time, I doubt that it is the interest of 14 Security Council members to tolerate the Russian strategy of undermining the Council's credibility. I urge the Security Council to demonstrate resoluteness in safeguarding this organ and its mandate from the destructive Russian practices. And I do not apologize that I was not careful listening to the drivel by the Russian ambassador, but I need to break the news to the Russian delegation. Scientific evidence still suggests that all modern humans are descendant from African population of Homo sapiens that spread out of Africa about 60,000 years ago, and I'm proud to be one of them. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Ukraine for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Estonia.
Thank you, Mr. President. I am speaking on behalf of the Baltic countries, Latvia, Lithuania, and my own country, Estonia. I thank the briefers for their updates on the alarming humanitarian situation in Ukraine and the daily work by UNICEF and OCHA to help those affected by the brutal Russian military aggression. We cannot consider this dire situation without making clear who, by choice, started this war and who can end it: the Russian Federation, which must put an end to its aggression and the suffering of children in Ukraine. The Russian aggression has been accompanied by killing, torture, and terror aimed at civilians, while demonizing and dehumanizing them in the Russian war propaganda. Make no mistake, children have been and continue to be targets for Russia. За детей, for children, written on the side of a Russian missile that struck the Kramatorsk train station, was a cynical but revealing expression of this. Children born in shelters during bombings, living through days of air raids and destruction, stepping on trains, leaving their homes and families behind. The UN has recorded 238 children killed and over 300 injured in Ukraine since 24th of February, as it admits a clear underestimate. Hundreds of schools and educational institutions destroyed and damaged according to the UN, most recently in Bilohorivka, resulting in the death of over 60 people after a Russian bomb flattened the school. Children suffering in besieged cities such as Mariupol without access to humanitarian assistance. In less than 3 months, 14 million people, including 2/3 of Ukraine's children, have been forced to leave their homes. Ukraine's Human Rights Commissioner asserts that more than 121,000 children have been forcibly deported to Russia. The forced deportations, along with the Russian steps towards legislative changes to accelerate the adoption of children from Ukraine, in violation of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, need to be monitored by the UN and other relevant organizations. The Russian actions represent violations of international law amounting to war crimes and crimes against humanity, as well as grave violations against children in conflict. This includes killing and maiming, attacks against schools and hospitals, and sexual violence. Russia's crimes are recorded and it will be held accountable. We underline and support the role of the ICC and the UN Commission of Inquiry and the UN monitoring mission in this work. We call for the full implementation of the Security Council Resolution 1612, as well as further resolutions on children and armed conflict, including Resolution 2601 on the protection of education. We recall that Russia, a permanent member of this council, has endorsed and has to comply with these. We underline the importance of the recording, monitoring, and reporting on violations against children in Ukraine to the Security Council, including the Secretary General's Special Representative on Children and Armed Conflict. We value the tireless work by UNICEF, other UN agencies, and civil society in Ukraine and beyond to protect children. We welcome the work of the UN and ICRC in coordinating the efforts to ensure the safe passage of civilians, including children, from Mariupol. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania will continue to support the work of these organizations and to provide financial and in-kind humanitarian assistance to Ukraine in the total amount of more than 46 million euros. We have welcomed those fleeing the war in Ukraine and offered them access to our education and health systems, as well as online learning opportunities and mental health support for children in Ukraine and those outside. Mr. President, this Council has stood strong in calling for the protection of children in conflict. It needs to be strong and absolutely clear in calling on Russia to put an end to its aggression and to the horrors it has brought to children in Ukraine. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Estonia for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Poland.
Mr. President, members of the Security Council, Excellencies, I would like to thank the United States for organizing this important and timely briefing and for shedding light on the situation of children in Ukraine in the aftermath of Russia's aggression. I would also like to thank the excellent briefers, Ms. Joyce Msuya and Mr. Omar Abdi, for their insights and, more importantly, all their work in helping the youngest victims of Russian aggression. Mr. Chair, since the outbreak of war, more than 3.3 million people, as of today, mostly women and children, have crossed from Ukraine into Poland to seek refuge. Poland, both as a state and as a society, makes every effort to meet their needs. Ensuring that children continue their education is one of our top priorities. Keeping in mind that the interruption of the educational process, even for a short period of time, has long-lasting effects and can prevent students from returning to learning, we are determined to ensure that each of those affected by war can continue their education. Depending on parents' preferences, we offer support by enrolling children in Polish schools or providing them with equipment necessary for distance learning within the Ukrainian educational system. For those who want to continue their education in Polish schools, we organize preparatory classes, which will help them to find their way in the Polish educational system and to overcome the language barrier. Currently, there are almost 200,000 refugee children from Ukraine in Polish schools. About 20% of them attend preparatory classes and 80% attend regular classes together with Polish children. The Ministry of Education has created an online platform where various educational tools are available for free. In addition, the Ministry organizes special language courses for teachers from Ukraine who have come to Poland. Courses are also organized for Polish teachers, including in Ukrainian language, to make it easier for them to communicate with children coming from Ukraine and better respond to their educational needs. Additionally, I would like to present a project of the Polish Center for International Aid in coordination with CARE. As part of Cash for Work program, Ukrainian teachers find employment in Polish schools and kindergartens as assistants of refugee children. We also pay particular attention to the needs of children with disabilities. Children with special education needs, as well as their parents, can benefit from psychological and pedagogical assistance in Polish kindergartens and schools. Students who are pursuing higher education in Ukraine before the outbreak of war can also continue their studies at Polish universities. Moreover, we launched several programs offering institutional and financial support for academics from Ukraine to enable them to continue their research projects. Excellencies, schools provide children with education, but they play a much bigger role in their lives. In times of war, classrooms can and should provide children with a sense of stability and act as a safe space to learn and to process the trauma. However, across Ukraine, hundreds of schools have been destroyed in Russian shelling and airstrikes. Many classrooms are simply unusable after being damaged or destroyed. Even after the war is over, it will still take a long time to rebuild the schools and other educational facilities. Attacks on civilian areas, including civilian infrastructure, are endangering children's lives and their futures. Poland condemns, in the strongest possible terms, attacks against civilians and civilian objects, such as schools, hospitals, and orphanages. All perpetrators of violations of international law, especially humanitarian international law and human rights, must be held accountable. Mr. Chair, over 2,000 patients from Ukraine are hospitalized in Poland. Nearly half of them are children. A pediatric hub was established in the city of Lublin, from where young patients are being transferred to institutions all over the country and abroad. It has to be stressed that Ukrainian children, just like all children all around the world, were already dealing with mental health challenges from being isolated during almost 2 years of the pandemic. Now, having left the comforts of home, not to mention their family and friends who stayed in Ukraine to fight, any move towards pre-pandemic normalcy has been cruelly interrupted. Poland offers psychiatric, psychological, and other mental health social services to help Ukrainian refugees. However, the needs are growing every day. Mr. President, Poland is doing the best we can to help Ukrainian children in those troubled and terrifying times, offering them safety of our homes in Poland, among our families, and a kind of normal life with its duties and joys. We hope that we are able to save at least part of their dreams and their childhood. And I thank you.
I thank the representative of Poland for her statement. And I will now give the floor to the representative of Slovakia.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to start by thanking today's briefers, Assistant Secretary General Suya and Deputy Executive Director of UNICEF, Mr. Abdi, for their presentations, which once again shed light on devastating impacts of the Russian war in Ukraine, this time specifically on the issue of children and their right to education. We appreciate the updates that you have shared with us, and we were listening carefully, and we will certainly factor all the additional information in our further work and activities. As the UNICEF's Regional Advisor on Child Protection for Europe and Central Asia said earlier on the 6th of May in a press briefing, hospitals, including nurseries and schools, continue to be impacted by strikes, unfortunately. Slovakia therefore categorically condemns these attacks, including the most recent one in Bilohorivka in the Luhansk region. This attack, together with all the attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure, constitute a flagrant violation of international humanitarian law and must be thoroughly investigated, and justice must be served. We also concur with the Secretary General that this attack is yet another reminder that in a war, civilians pay the highest price, and I add children in particular. We have been following these developments very carefully also in our current capacity as Vice President of the Executive Board of UNICEF and as a neighboring and directly affected country. According to the most recent reports, including update from the OHCHR monitoring mission in Ukraine as of the 11th of May, more than 230 children have already lost their lives and more than 340 children have been injured. Approximately 2/3 of Ukrainian children have been forced to flee their homes, and all of them have been negatively affected. This is a terrible and devastating impact on the future generation, which we also have to bear in mind. Instead of enjoying their childhood, millions of Ukraine's children are witnessing the horrors of war without bearing even the tiniest fraction of guilt for what is happening. They are being separated from their families and friends, directly exposed to blaring sirens, bomb explosions, physical and unfortunately even sexual violence, causing them physical harm and enormous psychological traumas they will need months and years to cope with, if ever. They are stripped of their fundamental right of access to safe and quality education, which in many cases prompts their mothers to take on the main responsibility for homeschooling. This is a special achievement, quote unquote, of the Russian, and again, quote unquote, special military operation. And I say it with a heavy heart. Or in correct words, a child crisis of unprecedented proportions and one of the fastest large-scale displacement of children since the Second World War, caused by the Russian unjustified, unprovoked, and senseless aggression against Ukraine, constituting a blatant violation of the UN Charter and international law. Mr. President, just briefly, I would like to add from Slovakia's perspective that we have already received over 136,000 children that have entered Slovakia, and over 30,000 have been granted temporary protection so far. Children fleeing Ukraine are provided with as complex care and support as possible, including psychosocial assistance, medical care, and assistance in connecting or reuniting with their relatives and families. We have been able to enroll approximately 10,000 children aged 3 to 17 in Slovak schools, and we work hard to increase this number to provide all the refugee children staying in Slovakia with proper education. I'm pleased that also the United States First Lady, Mr. President, could have seen recently these efforts herself a few days ago. She met with the teachers, with the mothers. It was actually on Mother's Day that she went there to support them and to express her solidarity and compare notes about all the practical aspects of their life. Refugee children involved in the educational process are also entitled to a food subsidy. Together with our partners from UNICEF and UNHCR, we have agreed to develop a joint child protection capacity building plan for implementing partners and other stakeholders in child protection, inclusion, and education. Slovakia continues to stand in solidarity with Ukraine, and as a close friend and good neighbor, we do and we will continue doing our utmost to help relieve suffering of the people. We appreciate the work of international organizations and institutions aiming to improve the humanitarian situation. And I am also pleased to add that the Prime Minister of Slovakia, Mr. Eduard Heger, recently announced additional financial contribution, which includes, among others, a contribution of €130,000 for the specific UNICEF program and project. To conclude, Mr. President, Slovakia once again calls on the Russian Federation to immediately cease hostilities against Ukraine and unconditionally withdraw all its troops from the whole territory of Ukraine. This is the only way how we can stop our children from suffering. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Slovakia for his statement. At this time, there are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.
Vamos a